Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are discussing part 4 of Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy's book, The 5 Big Questions. And we are now on to the third question: why couldn't Pakistan become an Islamic state? So, Dr. Hoodbhoy, let's start from the basics. Is there a concept of an Islamic state? If so, what is meant by it?
Whatever a Muslim believes has ultimately to come from the Quran and to an extent the Hadith. But in the Quran, every scholar agrees that the word state is not written into it. And actually, there's a very simple reason, because the Arabic word for state does not exist. Today, there are, of course, new inventions like Dawla, but that word had no meaning at that time. There was no concept of a geographically bounded state, any state, even a Christian state at that time. That came much, much later, 1648, purely European. That of a geographically bounded state.
1648, what came?
It was the Treaty of Westphalia, which was negotiated between European rulers of that time, the kings and the emperors and the nobles of that time, and that resulted in an agreement between them that these are national boundaries. If they are to be crossed, then by a trader, for example, they must pay a certain tithe for that. Custom duties, that the armies will not cross over, etc. These are boundaries in the modern sense.
So prior to Westphalia and the creation of nation states, there was just a greater concept of a Christian kind of state. So you can have several of these states under some one centralized authority.
Well,
they were fighting continuously.
The history of Europe is very bloody. There was the 100 Years' War, there was the 30 Years' War. It was between Christians and Protestants and absolutely decimated Europe. And so that's a European concept. And I say it came centuries later. At the time of the Holy Prophet, there was no such concept. And there was, and in addition to this, let's look at what's in the Hadith. The Holy Prophet tells you how you must live your lives, how you must worship, how you should
give
marry, all those rules of social behavior. But there's nothing about administration. There's nothing about who is to be responsible for doing various things. So, for example, there's no such thing as a department of taxation. There are no jails or prisons. There's not even a professional army. All able-bodied men are supposed to fight at some point against the enemy or for jihad or whatever, but that's not a professional army which is dedicated to this task. Similarly, the other functions of the state, of justice, for example, now all that came much, much later, and it came as the idea of a state evolved over the centuries, but there was nothing there. But even more important was who should run the state, who should be the ruler. And there was no rule of succession that was specified. In fact, the Holy Prophet did not even say who would succeed him. And as we know, that led to bitter complications with the age of the Khulafai Rashidin and then the schisms that came off it, the Shia and the Sunni coming off it and so forth. So if you look at it in literal terms, certainly the Islamic State did not exist even at the time of the Holy Prophet. Now, the interesting thing is, a lot of people don't agree with this. There's Maulana Tahirul Qadri, You remember he used to come in with Imran Khan and in all those jalsas.
That's right.
He's also got a lot of following in Europe. I've seen his schools in Norway and Sweden. Well, his PhD thesis, he's called Maulana Dr. Tahirul Qadri. His PhD thesis is on the Medina state. And certainly he must have been an important influence on Imran Khan, who talks about the Riyasat-e-Medina. In his PhD thesis, he goes through whatever material is available from 630 onwards. There's not very much, because most of the written stuff, the originals have been destroyed, but then there is commentary on them, so one assumes that they exist. And so what he's done is he's developed his idea that there was such a thing as the Medina state, that the agreement reached between warring tribes constitutes what he calls an official constitution. And as part of so then he lists what was the agreement reached between the tribes, and I think it would be very nice if you could remind me of the points.
Right. Now, this was an agreement, the Misaq-e-Medina was an agreement between the Prophet and other Muslim tribes existing in Medina and the Jews and everybody who lived there, right?
Yes,
that was the
Jewish tribes and
various Jewish tribes and the Muslim. And so he says, settling various blood feuds between tribes, payment of ransoms. So this is, I suppose, the if one happens to kill the other, there will be some kind of a blood money exchange. Qasas, right, that's right. 2, restrictions on killing of believers at the instigation of non-believers. So I don't know restrictions on whether there were similar restrictions on killing of non-believers by believers or not, but anyway, restrictions on killing of believers. 3, guaranteeing of life protection for Muslims and Jews. So those were the. So I suppose Jews were not considered non-believers, I suppose, at that point. They must have been
Ahl-e-Kitab.
They were Ahl-e-Kitab.
People of the book.
So these are perhaps the unconverted original Arabic tribes who are neither Jews nor Muslims at that point. Number 4, rules for sanctioning revenge killing. So there were rules for, you could do revenge killing if somebody sanctioned it. 5, rules for apportioning of war expenses between Muslims and Jews. So in a way, how you're going to finance your wars. 6, declarations of equality between different Jewish tribes. 7, prohibition of treachery, that you will not betray, I suppose. 8, denial of shelter for women unless agreed by their families. So this is the structure of a state.
Well, I have reproduced here only 8 of, I think, 61 or 63 agreements that were reached between the tribes, and these are some of them. Now, anyone who would like to get into more details, I would refer them to Dr. Tahirul Qadri's thesis. But having read through that, by the way, it's available on the internet, so you can just go to Google. Having read through that, one doesn't see it as actually a constitution and telling you how to set up a state and how to run it, and it doesn't even tell you even very basic rules. Now, the fact is that life in those times and life in these times is totally different. Now, there were only 50,000 people in Makkah and Medina at that time. 50,000 is less than what you would have in a mohalla of Karachi.
Yeah.
And of course, the resources available then, resources available now, the problems then, the problems now are very different. And so we don't get, I'm perfectly sure, of course, that this was a very wise way of mediating the differences between the tribes, and this is the best
for its time. It
for
was
its time.
it was a very big step.
But it doesn't tell you anything about the nature of the Islamic State. And we see this confusion then propagating throughout history. So from the Khulafai Rashidin to the Umayyads to the Abbasis and onwards. In fact, you don't see a discussion on the nature of the Islamic State until Al-Mawardi comes along, and that is 900 and something, in which the question becomes whether one should obey the ruler or not, and if a ruler is misbehaving, if the ruler of a Muslim state is misbehaving, how should he be removed and who should remove him? And so those issues
those
come
questions
up
come in about 250 years after the Prophet.
Yes, 300 years
300
later
years
or so.
after a Prophet.
Yes.
I mean, just to give the people, the due from them, can they look at the Misaq-e-Medina and from the 8 that you have given out of the 61 and derive normative principles of running a state?
They were, according to the times, the meaning of justice. Today, of course, we do not allow revenge killings at all.
Right.
Today, we do not allow slavery. In fact, that is forbidden by the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It's even forbidden by the Constitution of Pakistan. So I guess one could extract some principles of justice, but then justice has a meaning that has changed over time.
Right. And I mean, if for practical people, you can try to get the normative principles out of Misaq-e-Medina, more power to you if you want to. But then there are modern nation states, extremely successful, who have had several hundred years of experience of evolving into very successful states. Why wouldn't we go to those sources and actually pick the best out of whatever is there from the Chinese modern state, American, European, Russian, even other Muslim states that are practicing? We would pick something out from there.
Well, that's a wider question, and then there's the question of well, if you do that, then you lose your identity. Then people feel as if they would be denying their past. Although I think that we all have to admit that social evolution, political evolution has happened, and that things are no longer what they were in the 7th century.
Right. Okay, so there is, in a way, what you're saying is that certainly there is nothing cut and dried about what an Islamic state is and what it looks like. But if we now look at the Muslim countries, and we see a great variety of models, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Afghanistan, if you will, on one end of the spectrum today, while Turkey, Tunisia, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia on the other end, the secular end, right? So where would you place Pakistan on this spectrum?
By the way, I would exclude Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states from this now, because the rapid changes that have happened over there now make them rather liberal states. After all, now women are being given the right to drive, to go in public with heads not covered. Not Iran. Iran, of course, as we know, has gone through a very turbulent period and is going through that now on the issue of hijab, but formally it is no longer required in UAE or Saudi Arabia.
Right. Well,
So where
just,
does
yeah. I mean, 3 months ago, my wife and I happened to go for Umrah, and this was after 5 years we arrived in Saudi Arabia. Completely different country. I mean, we arrived in Medina, and every immigration officer was a woman, not a single man. And when we came out after getting our Torres immigration, the ladies who approached, the people, the security that approached us were also ladies. And then, as we said, when we traveled in the trains, there were women with their hair open. So just to testify what you're saying, that the changes are remarkable from just the time that Mohammed bin Salman has come into power, actually.
Yes. Unfortunately, it is change from above. It's not something that was demanded from below, but it certainly has achieved a resonance with the Saudi Arabian youth. They love it. The conservatives hate it, but they dare not say anything, else they will meet the fate of Jamal Khashoggi.
Right. So you will right now, that's right, but still there is this spectrum, was Iran, Afghanistan, and then there is Turkey. Where would Pakistan fit in this spectrum from secular to highly conservative religious state?
I think we have moved considerably towards the conservative, towards the ultra-orthodox. Not so much in Karachi and the posh areas of Karachi, of Rawalpindi, of Islamabad, but if you go to most places in Pakistan, if you go to Peshawar, to Kohat, or to places in Sindh, Larkana, you will see women are scarcely to be seen, or when seen they are in hijab or burqa. That's one indication, but then the other is that the mosques are full. There's 101% attendance over there. That during Ramzan there is no eating place available. The number of madrasas and the number of mosques are an indication of the hyper-religiosity in Pakistan. Further, there are very disturbing events that have happened. We have seen people being lynched in the name of having blasphemed. This has become so common that people are now very scared. So, for example, there was this Chinese supervisor who is very upset that his workers during Ramzan were taking off long prayer breaks, and he said, you can't do this, you're being paid for working over here. They accused him of blasphemy, and before you could even say, you could twitch your finger, you had thousands of people pouring in from all over, and the man was whisked away by helicopter to Abbottabad. This whole thing has been very rapidly hushed up because after all, it's CPEC and it's the Chinese. But if the Chinese are not secure in Pakistan,
right,
how would an ordinary Pakistani feel secure?
Dr. Saab, to be fair though, a population that's very highly, let's say, practicing Muslims, there shouldn't be anything wrong with that. That's their right. If that's what they want to do. If there is let's say, even though whether you will consider this as a fair, that relative to Europe, America is much more religious in terms of it's the presence of religion and God, and their presence in Sunday churches much higher compared to Europe. And yet, America is as strictly inclusive and secular in its laws as any. They wouldn't permit mixing of religion, etc. So my point in Pakistan would be the same, that other than the overt behavior of people as practicing Muslims, are there laws in Pakistan, etc., which place them much more towards the orthodoxy than secularism?
I think that was written into the law very early on with the Objectives Resolution of 1948, where a distinction was made between Muslims and non-Muslims, and different rights were given to them. Of course, it was always said that the rights of non-Muslims would be protected, but those rights are not the same as those of Muslims. In time, it became clearer that it's not just de jure, it's also de facto that there's a difference. And if you look at the jobs that Christians can have as compared to Muslims, and similarly for Hindus, there's a huge difference in that. In no way are they considered equal citizens. So you asked me the question on the scale of orthodoxy to liberalism, where is Pakistan? And I'd say it's very close to orthodoxy and is getting closer. In fact, I would say is getting close to Afghanistan, rather than moving away towards Malaysia or Indonesia, which lie at the other end of the spectrum.
And there's the additional danger that given today's current political vacuum and crisis, that the people who may most benefit from it may be the more religiously extreme forces actually can easily benefit from something like that. Look at history and the scholarship on the issue of Islamic State. What is it that we find? I mean, again, what kind of evolution has happened in terms of Islamic State?
So we have had areas of Muslim domination, and those areas have been under a leadership, at times one Khalifa, at times Caliph, at times two Khalifas, and at times even three Khalifas. And of course, the Caliphate ultimately ended in 1924 with the dissolution of the Turkish Caliphate. So in those 1200 years or so, what we saw, well, in the early period of Islam, there was a rapid expansion outwards. So everywhere from Indonesia all the way up till Spain and Morocco. And those areas were governed separately. I mean, there wasn't a Khalifa who would simultaneously be in Spain and could command authority in Indonesia. In fact, Indonesia is totally different from the Arab states in that respect. Or, in fact, there was no reign of a Khalifa on the subcontinent. Never was. There were Mughal rulers, and the earlier ones who came in from Central Asia and from Afghanistan, but there was not any kind of a there was never any kind of an Islamic state over there.
The kingship evolved. I mean, they were originally all Khalifas, and the concept of a Khalifa is what? A vice regent of God. I mean, somebody who represents. So within the Khalifa, you have both a secular and a religious authority, or at least somebody charged with the responsibility to enforce both the secular law and the religious law.
So if you read Maulana Maududi, he says the Islamic State is Khilafatul Arz. That is to say, it is the reign of God on earth. And in charge of that is the Khalifa, and it is his duty to be the vice regent. So he is the one who is ultimately responsible for translating what is there in the Holy Book or the Hadith into the laws of the country and how the country must be run. In that respect, sovereignty belongs to Allah. It does not belong to the people. And so there has always been the question of whether an Islamic state should be democratic or should it be run by someone who's there.
Right. But doesn't the Pakistan Constitution finesse it very well by saying that the sovereignty belongs to Allah, which is exercised through the people?
Yes, but then what comes along is the dictator who says that I will then be responsible for running the country. And yes, of course, sovereignty belongs to Allah, but I'm going to decide how it's going to be run. This is a contradiction which has not been dealt with in any satisfactory way. And so it's very interesting that Maulana Maududi and his discussion of the Islamic State, where he says this will be Khilafatul Arz, he opposed the idea of there being elections and the popular vote. And you could say that he was actually echoing Allama Iqbal's views on this, who had also not espoused the idea of Western parliamentary democracy and instead said that there should be various shuras, Majlis-e-Shura. And now the shura has to be made of pious men. What about women? And not clear at all whether women should be there or not. Iqbal never said that women should be there.
Yeah.
And certainly from what I've read of Maududi, women have no place in that. How would they be elected? Not clear. Who would they be chosen from? Well, of course, the pious and the God-fearing and the righteous ones. I'm not sure how to find out whether somebody is God-fearing and pious. He can pray a lot. He can make 20 umrahs as people normally do. I mean, powerful people.
Right.
Throw in a couple of hajjs. Go for a hajj here, hajj there. Does that make you a pious, God-fearing Muslim or not? I don't know. I'm very puzzled about that because after all, Pakistan is a very
Not necessarily. One can easily say it doesn't. I mean, it's all in your actions. If after all of this you still do milawat in milk and you still take money away from the people or you don't give them the rights, then what good is all of that?
All the white-collar crime?
All the white-collar crimes.
Of course, did not exist in those days, and it's so very hard to say that he's done something immoral and is not God-fearing. He could be God-fearing and still be taking his 10% cut.
Right.
After all, do remember that Mr. Asif Ali Zardari used to sacrifice a kala bakra every day that he was president of Pakistan, and yet he's not known to be a particularly honest person.
I mean, what you're referring to is people can wear their religion on their sleeves and actually act much worse than totally somebody who's a non-believer and doesn't need all of that.
There's an even more serious problem. Now, what do you do about, in this Khilafatul Arz, what do you do about Shia?
Right.
What do you do about Ismailis who the Shia are reluctant to accept as being amongst them? And so in a pluralist state, this whole concept of Shura breaks down.
Well, I mean, frankly, what bothers me as a Pakistani is just this ability that non-Muslims cannot be in positions, this position, that just completely, I mean, I lived or traveled across the world. They had a black president in the United States. They have a Hindu prime minister in the UK. They have a Muslim chief minister in Scotland. They have a Hindu prime minister in Ireland. I mean, the question in a sense is that in a world which is increasingly breaking down these man-made divisions, so to speak, in the name. We sometimes say that these man-made divisions are God-made, but I mean, we understand these are man-made.
So, we were talking about the Islamic State. There is an alternative to that, which is Shia, which is Vilayat-e-Faqih. So, here the ulema will interpret what is God's word. It's not the Khalifa. The difference is between the two is that the Shia ulema have been very methodical. They have their training centers in the seminary there, and there is a well-established hierarchy, whereas in Sunni Islam there is not that hierarchy. Sure, there is a mufti, but is that mufti recognized by everyone in that country? Is that mufti recognized in a country outside of Pakistan or some other country? Answer is no. Here, there's a very fundamental problem with the Islamic State. Very fundamental. Nobody can say what the true Islam is, because there's no equivalent of the Pope in Islam.
There's not one You actually, in this chapter, go through different models. You've referred to the Medina state. You have, I think, perhaps, I don't know whether fully referred to Maududi's Islamic state. I think you've talked about at least a little bit of that. You then, the model 3 you give it is a Taliban Islamic state. Of course, that is perhaps the most regressive and totally sort of goes back to the 7th century, and that too in its worst form, so to speak.
Well, the Taliban state is the least visualized state, the least thought about state, and it's not that it's just the developments of the last 1 or 2 years. For the last 1 decade, people have been asking Taliban leaders, and they've been asking them both inside Afghanistan, but also when they come out, places like Doha where the peace talks were, and then when they are invited or were invited to the United States, they were asked, why are you fighting against the government in Kabul, Ashraf Ghani or Hamid Karzai's government? The answer was that they're not Islamic. Okay, so in what ways are you different from them?
Right.
What is it in their governance, in their government that you find un-Islamic? And they said just one thing. They would just always repeat one thing. They are in the pay of the Americans. It's the Americans who are in Afghanistan, and we cannot tolerate foreign interference in our country. But beyond that, there's nothing they could say. And so today what you find is the least imagined state possible. It's it's all before us, that they won't allow women to work, they won't allow them to go to schools, everybody has to have a beard, you have to pray 5 times a day, otherwise you will get caned or whipped. If you're caught not fasting, you can be beaten black and blue. So that's the kind of primitivism of the Afghan Taliban state, and I'm afraid that if the TTP makes further inroads into Pakistan, that's what we could become.
You said that there is no central authority, no clarity on the issue of. It's the central question to really ask, really at the heart of this debate, is that does Islamic State make for a more moral society and a more moral practicing individual? Because, I go back to our discussion on one of the other parts where you were present when Qazi Hussain Ahmed, then the chief of Jamaat-e-Islami, was giving a talk in America. And here he says, in America, what you heard, that I can go to my mosque freely, I can wear the clothes I want to wear, I can fast here. He can actually also proselytize. He can go to people and try to convert them. So he can completely act like the moral Muslim that he wants to be, and practicing Muslim in a totally secular society. Now the question is that a Christian and a Jew living in Saudi Arabia can't do any of this. He can't do any of this in Pakistan also. So if the central point of an Islamic state is what? And you can also argue, I would say, that if you're in Iran or Saudi Arabia, are you a more moral society in terms of human rights and preservations and giving them their due and giving them justice? So that's what should be the criteria, not some label that is called Islamic.
Well, it's very interesting that when it is pointed out that Muslims can make mosques in the United States or anywhere in Europe, but that making a church in Saudi Arabia is forbidden, and it's forbidden even under Mohammed bin Salman. The answer is given that yes, it's good that they let us do it, but we can't let them do it here, because we know that there is only one true religion, and that religion is Islam. And so this is what I believe is, well, another word for this is Islamic supremacy.
Or self-righteousness totally gone wrong. Or
well, that's your point of view on this. It's also mine, but
yes, yeah, supremacy. I think there is this sense that somehow we have the right on our side, rather than humility that maybe we can prove with our actions.
You see, you can't be humble if you think that you are the last religion to come, the best religion that has ever existed, and therefore you cannot, in all honesty, allow anybody else to compete.
Right.
So that's a point of view, and it's held by, I would say, a sizable number of people, if not the overwhelming majority.
But then there are truly religious people with the real spirit who, to such questions, say, Wallah alam. I mean, basically they say, we know nothing, and we leave it in a way, which is another way of true humility. Wallah alam, meaning these are questions I can't decide for myself. So we have come to, well, let's see if there's something that there are some things that, looking at Pakistan's political evolution from 47 onwards, we start with the Objectives Resolution, which was an attempt to reconcile Pakistan's Islamic identity with its commitment to democratic values and fundamental rights. Then the 73 Constitution went a lot further in declaring Islam as the state religion and creating a parallel sharia court system. Then in Ziaul Haq's reign, it went even further, strengthening blasphemy laws and introducing hudud ordinances. So here we are, in your opinion, arrived finally at a stable position where a national consensus of sorts on Islamization exists and is reflected in the Constitution. So do you think we are in this stable situation where at least the mainstream religious parties, let's say, Jamaat Islami, Jamiyat-e-Ulama Islam, and other parties, People's Party, and everybody seems to be in agreement?
Well, I don't hear demands for changing the 1973 Constitution. It is accepted by all political parties. In fact, there was recently a celebration of that. But here, because this is by majoritarian consensus, there is no voice which says that equal rights be given to minorities. It's now accepted that Pakistan is a majoritarian state with no space or very little space to the non-Muslims of this country. But there is even a more serious issue, because the Constitution is not being adhered to in letter, much less in spirit. And that is in the education sector, where Muslim religious education is being forced onto non-Muslims, although that is expressly forbidden by the Constitution. And so if you look at the books that are under the single national curriculum, they're an open, clear, flagrant violation of the Constitution. But, well, it's all sloughed over.
Yeah. So there was one positive when TTP, which doesn't accept Pakistan's constitution, the defenders that came in and spoke against the TTP and basically said were the religious parties. So I suppose they said, no, our forefathers or our fathers had signed this constitution, and this is the constitution that we... So I thought that at least we have created a bit... I know what you're saying, and I completely, but I think we may have created, at least for a while, a mechanism where we have said, this is it, this is the Islamization, we're not going any further than this. This is the kind of country we want. That's a good thing.
Certainly, the 1973 Constitution is something that's not acceptable to TTP because it does leave various things that it doesn't make Pakistan quite into a Sharia state.
Right.
What the TTP would like is Pakistan to become Afghanistan. And of course, there's the small issue of the Durand line, which is always the case of a conflict between two nation states. But the important thing is that here is this issue of whether Pakistan should be run purely by Islamic law. I mean, there is a part of our legal system, you can go to the Sharia courts or you can go to the common courts, but it's the vast majority go to the common courts and they fight it out with their with the usual legal apparatus over there, judges and lawyers and defendants and witnesses and all that, which is not the case for the Qazi courts, which are specified under the Sharia. Okay, so we opted with the 1973 Constitution for a dual system. They don't want a dual system, they want a unitary system. That's the difference.
Big difference. Let me ask you sort of interesting questions also in a way troubled me is that Muslim countries that came out of a yoke of colonialism, wherever they were, certainly in Pakistan and India, were all run initially when they handed over the power by secular elites. They were handed over to Mr. Jinnah and then Mr. Liaquat Ali Khan to run, etc. And now, of course, all of them, or a number of them, have gone through a process of evolution where a political Islam has come into this. So obviously, there's something that the secular elites did. One may blame them for not creating the right conditions for the evolution to take place on a more progressive scale rather than the regressive scale.
Yes, indeed, one sees the emergence of religious forces both in India and Pakistan, and of course in Iran as well. And if you look at other countries in the world, that is also true in Indonesia as well. And I think here one has to look at post-colonial history. So if you go back after the Second World War, you had all these secular elites, secular rulers. You had Jamal Abdul Nasser, you had Muhammad Ali Jinnah, you had Bourguiba, and you had
Shah of Iran.
Shah Iran. And yes, then, well, Shah Iran, but before him, Mossadegh.
Yeah, Mossadegh.
Mossadegh was a nationalist, secularist, but got torpedoed, just like Nasser got torpedoed, just like Sukarno got torpedoed by the greedy Western powers. And that left a vacuum, which then was filled by the Islamists. And so that's how political Islam came into being. It was, okay, the internal corruption of leaders, but it was also the external factors that were extremely important then.
My last question is that what kind of probability would you give for Pakistan to become a secular state like Bangladesh?
Oh, you're asking me a very hard question because at the present time we are headed the other way. There's no doubt about that. The extent to which our policies of creating jihadist groups and of using religion in politics has created a vast mass, a vast army of people who know nothing except religious rituals. I won't call them people of great, necessarily of great faith, but certainly they're imbued with the ideas of following a certain path and knowing what to do. When somebody says, oh, he is a blasphemer, then they'll go out on the streets. And then we have the TLP, Tehreek-Labbaik Pakistan. So we're headed the opposite direction. So I don't expect anything now.
Anytime soon.
I don't expect anything in the lives of my children. But thereafter, it's got to get better. Look, it happened in Europe.
Yeah.
When there was the 30 Years' War between France and Germany, they decimated each other, and there weren't even nuclear weapons at that time, but something like 30% of Germany's population was dead, and the rest were going to starve. And that's the time that the two countries had to make peace with each other over a religious war. So I think things will change, but it'll take time.
It will extract a price, even greater perhaps. So just the last word for our listeners, how would you answer the question that you raised? Why, you said, couldn't Pakistan become an Islamic state? What's your answer?
It is too diverse. It's got too many ethnicities. It's got too many strains of faith. And if there was to be one imposed upon them all, so let's say that it was to be the Hanafi sharia, that would then tear the country apart, because others would be calling for Maliki, or what about the Shia who don't accept any of these four jurists?
Right.
They would be up in revolt, and it would be a complete and total mess. So it would lead to civil war. It would lead to the total suppression of women. It would lead to Pakistan's excommunication from the community of nations, and so we would become a pariah state.
Would you add in your mix of our pluralistic things, why, well, thank God for all of those things that we have, would you also add our history of our syncretic culture? Being situated in the subcontinent has also been a factor, given our history and our inclusive past and our Sufi traditions, that we have at least dodged the bullet of a very regressive Islamic state.
So I implicitly meant that, because when I said there are different schools of thought, well, yes, even among Sunnis, Barelvi and Deobandi, they are at loggerheads with each other. But as far as Sufi goes, well, of course, Sufis again have a variety of strains in them. What do you do with the Zikris? What do you do with the Ismailis? What do you do with the Shia Hazara?
Right.
And so in a country that is as diverse as Pakistan, the only way that you can make this a Sharia state is by massive use of force.
Right.
We only have to look at what the Sharia state did in Swat in 2008, 2009 under Maulana Fazlullah and his father-in-law. Now, just to give you one example, of the many stupidities they did, well, of course, they killed a lot. There was Huni chalk over there. There was blood all over the place, bodies hanging from lampposts. But among the many other stupidities also, they decreed that to drive on the left side of the road is haram.
Why is that?
Well, left is bad, you know.
Left is bad.
And so half the people were driving on the left and half on the right. And then you had bang, lots of collisions.
On that at least happy note, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to our discussion of the third question, why Pakistan failed to become Islamic State. We will next take up in the next episode the fourth question, why is Pakistan a Praetorian state? Till then, please take care.